There we go.
Pike. Maybe a fourth cast. Not bad. Dude, that was such a bite. That's a pretty one. Dude, he's been caught before. He's a retread.
Yep.
Two, three, four, lines in.
So let's talk a little bit about my strategy for this tournament, because we get off to a pretty hot start here, but basically there's a stretch of riprap which I know held a lot of fish, and my game plan was to come here and get a limit with top water. Now I had done really well in this spot during practice with a swim jig, but I knew based on how many I caught on top water when it got a little cloudy on that day that we could probably have some pretty good success here in the morning. So we're going to burn down this bank with top water, and things get off to a pretty hot start.
$18 inches. That's a good one for this place. 18.
Well, that's what we need right there, boys.
Look at that, guys.
That's a little Crosse giant.
19 inches, dude. That's huge for a little guy. There is a dead catfish. Carp. I don't know what that is. Oh, it's a drum. There you go. See that? Yeah. Literally the So at this point, I've got 4 fish, and I've pretty much worked over that far bank a bit. I'm gonna let Ryan have a crack at it, and I make a move to where he started and didn't catch any, because for whatever reason, it seemed like they like the white whopper plopper a little better. Make a ton of casts, go by a bunch of people bank fishing, don't really catch anything, decide to make a move and do another run down the bank where we started and see if we can fill out our limit. And what's funny is you'll notice throughout this entire video, these smallmouth fight so hard. And this one right here actually tricks me, and I'm like, okay, is this the 5th fish? Let's be extra careful with this, because if we get it, then we have our limit. Turns out that this fish doesn't help, and I ultimately decide not to net it. But I think it's a good testament to just how hard these smallmouth are fighting. So yeah, that's the day 1 limit right there. 5 fish, off to a really good start. 2 really good fish, 2 not so good fish, 1 okay fish. At this point, I'm feeling pretty good. I've got a solid limit. I know that I can upgrade in our secondary spot. I end up circling back here and talking to Ryan and being like, yeah, I'm going to make a move over to the secondary spot. He follows suit. He still hasn't caught any. I think he's feeling a little discouraged, and I know that the secondary spot will at least produce some, so that's where we decide to move. So we finally made it into our secondary spot. Ryan's fishing the front. I decided to pull the motor up and go into the pads. I actually ended up catching a 14.5-inch cull here, which helped a lot because those inches really mattered. Caught it on the frog, just kind of paddling like this into the pads. Unfortunately, my GoPro had overheated and paused during the actual catch. But this is essentially what I was doing for the next hour, was standing up, paddling through there. I think I ended up catching 4 or 5. A lot in that 12 to 13 inch range. It didn't really help me any. So really this spot was full of fish. I just couldn't seem to find the big ones. So we end up going back to the riprap and fishing it quite thoroughly. Don't really find any upgrades, but that's when we decided to make a spot move. We go to a spot we did really well on Friday in the afternoon at, and we decided to
I don't
launch
think
at a
you
different
can.
ramp. It turns out this ramp is pretty different than what we were expecting, where you actually have to walk pretty far to park your car, and the water was super shallow. So we end up going to this spot, and it is honestly
Maybe right
pretty
there.
uneventful. I'm going to show some of the highlights here, but you'll see what I mean.
Oh, yeah, I caught a couple small. Did you get any?
I had 4 blow-ups back there.
So spot number 2 doesn't really work out numbers wise for me, but I do end up culling with a pretty decent smallmouth, nearly 16 inches, and Ryan ends up filling out his limit. So the spot panned out pretty well for him. We happened to find a downed tree / beaver dam in some current, and we both caught some smallies off it with a wacky rig, which he was always hesitant to throw, but I think he's probably glad he put it on. So yeah, we ended the day at 20th with 81.25 inches, which isn't too bad. And going into day 2, I felt pretty confident, but I was a little worried that my spot was not going to hold out, which maybe my negativity jinxed us just a little bit. So we get on the board pretty early here, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see that our smallmouth are back, because this spot was more of a smallmouth spot during practice. It just happened to have some big largemouths on day 1. And we end up catching a smallmouth here to kind of get us started, and we are going to cull through a lot of fish today, but it is not going to be anything like yesterday. So I catch this fish, and I'm feeling confident that, hey, maybe I can get a limit here after all. So the first 2 passes up and down the riprap yield 2 small fish, and I'm feeling a little discouraged at this point because I'm unsure if this area is going to have the population that I need to actually get a solid limit. Luckily, this area does have some fallback plans. We're actually going to swoop around here to the marina where Ryan started on day 1, because I know for a fact there's got to be some decent fish lurking in there, because during practice that's where I caught all the nicer ones. So the Marina does produce a 16 incher here, as you see me letting it go. But I still don't feel too great about this particular area. I just don't feel like the numbers are there. So I end up going to the slough you saw me in day 1, where I picked up that 15 incher on the Frog. It is packed. There's 2 kayakers there. There's 2 bass boats there. There's a dude in the center crappie fishing. I fish it for a little bit and then ultimately decide, hey, let's go explore new water, see if we can pick up that 5th fish, because we're just sitting at 4. Our limit's not great, so we're going to have to make some big moves if we want to do any sort of respectable finish. So there's our limit right there with that little dinker on the wacky rig. I think it was like 13 inches. I decided to fish this area a little bit more, and that's when everybody's favorite fish to catch at La Crosse pops up, and that is bowfin. I catch a couple bowfin in like a short time span here on the wacky rig. This one right here is kind of taking me for a ride. The day's been going so crappy, I just decided, you know what, I might actually try to land this thing. Unfortunately, if you've ever bowfin fished, they get off very easily because they have very bony mouths. So we don't ultimately land this one, but we do land a giant one later, which unfortunately was not on GoPro. But that leads us to the turning point in this whole tournament where I decide to go to what worked best for me in practice, and that is milk running cut banks. And we are going to completely change our strategy up. That's a banger. That's a freaking banger. Let's talk about this strategy a little bit, because this was something that was successful for me during practice, which was targeting smallmouth around these cut banks. And essentially what you're looking for are these really steep mud banks with like a little bit of current where you could see that it's kind of carved out indentations in it. A lot of times if you didn't find these banks with current, there wouldn't be fish, so there was very particular things that you were looking for. That's sort of the challenge, because these are kind of obvious. A lot of people target them. They get banged up pretty bad, and there's not a lot of them. So you got to cover a lot of water if you're going to use this strategy, and you basically have to just run from point A to point B to point C to point D, so on and so forth. But if you watch this clip back here, this is almost like the ideal scenario where I cast it. I'm throwing like a little white swim jig with a small paddle tail swimmer on the back. Cast it right under like a little shaded pocket where you can see it's kind of recessed there. That's where those smallmouth get. They get right up against it. And if you see the smallmouth, it's really dark because it's been in that mud. And a lot of the smallmouth I caught during this tournament were really dark from being in that mud. But you can see that's like the ideal scenario there. You can see the shade line. I toss it in there, smallmouth smokes it, boom. So that fish actually ended up being 16.5 inches, I believe. One of the nicest smallmouth I caught in this particular area. But another kayaker who was over there saw me catch this fish and came over and had a conversation with me. Apparently, he was planning on fishing this route. He was not in contention to cash a check. I was. However, I don't think that that should be really a factor in, you know, having good manners. And since he fished here day 1 and this was kind of his plan, even though I could have said no, I just decided, you know what, I know where some more banks are. I'm just going to keep going because I think the more water I can cover, the better I can do. So we're actually going to go back to where we started, oddly enough.
Just like that, guys. Another big smallie. See, what did I say? Cut bangs, big smallies. Best fight of the day, by far.
So this is the crossroad. I've milked all my spot. I've kind of run out of cupping. I decide to go to my Thursday practice spot, which I was worried about going to because I really get a lot of pressure. I'm going to load up and drive roughly 30 miles south to an area down in Minnesota that I knew potentially could have some big smallmouth. Now when we get here, I see a boat in front of me and decide to start a little bit further back and just take a look what happens on the first cast.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty good luck today.
Good enough luck that this one isn't going to do much for me.
Okay. You go by like the fish or?
Length.
Okay. You gotta have a certain size to qualify or not?
Yeah, it needs to be 12.
Okay.
That one was 13 and a half, so it's smaller than my smallest.
So I know this spot's going to be loaded, and we absolutely
Saw that one hit it.
wrecking them. It is just on fire, cast after cast after cast.
Hey, that's the wrong species. You're the wrong species.
And then I run into these schools, which you can see here in the top left corner of the screen. It was just these schools of smallmouth, and they were all like 14 to 15 inches, but you know, if I needed a limit, this would have been a great spot. Unfortunately, it just wasn't helping me.
I don't think it's bigger.
So I worked those schools over pretty well and didn't really get anything over 14, 15 inches. So I decided to go back to the start and work a spot that I caught a pretty decent smallmouth on in some current during practice. And it actually pays off pretty nicely.
17.25. My Smallmouth commitment has paid off. I don't think he's gonna hold, but we'll net him. Are you 16 inches, dude? Because I'm pretty sure you're 15. Man, you float so hard in that current. 13. Oh, thank goodness. I think that was a gar. That's why it felt so weird. Ah.
You may notice we're back at the house. The rest of the footage unfortunately got the dreaded GoPro overheating problems that, you know, most people are accustomed to. If you ever use a GoPro in the summer, it's really tough, and we've lost the last couple of catches. But I'll show you some pictures here while we talk a little bit about the weekend as a whole. Basically, we caught a bunch of gar going into that. I probably had 20 to 25, 14 to 15 inch bass in that stretch of river that we kept just cycling through, and it kept reloading. Fortunately, we couldn't find any big ones. We did cull with a, I believe, 15.5 inch smallmouth. And then at the end, lines out is at 2:30. We hook into a 18 to 20 inch smallmouth, somewhere in that range. Unfortunately, I lose it in the current, and it was able to shake the hook, and it would have been enough to push us up into check range. I mean, we were just literally like an inch and a half off catching a check, which was really unfortunate. If we would have done a little bit better on day one when we had that two big kicker fish, if we would have been able to get a couple more to kind of get rid of those 14 inch rats, we might have actually had a chance of getting like a top 10. So we ended up finishing 19th, which is not really that bad considering it was a very competitive tournament, very competitive fishery with some really good anglers. So I'm pretty happy with the top 20 finish. It will definitely help the AOY push. It means that I just need to get top 50 at Susky and we'll make the classic qualifying. Let's talk about baits a little bit. So my strategy going into day one obviously was to throw topwater along those rocks. We threw this white whopper plopper. This is literally the same one we threw. A lot of people are wondering why I was throwing white. That's just what the smallmouth were keyed in on. I threw a bunch of different colors. White tended to work the best. We didn't catch any smallmouth really day one. It was all big largemouth, which surprised me. Once that spot dried up, it was really tough to find a bite. And I honestly think that some of the struggles I had second half of day one is what hurt us going into day two. So day two, we did start with this in that same area, but when we started working banks, I started throwing these finesse, northern style finesse just swim baits. We use a couple different variants of it. I started off with an evergreen grass burner, which I had trimmed up to be more of that northern style. I put a Jackal Rhythm wave on the back, the paddle tail swim bait, to kind of contrast it. It was a little bit darker, but white was what the smallmouth keyed in on. Everybody around that I knew were throwing like darker colors. I was throwing white. I knew smallmouth would key in on those white colors and it would help, and it did. And I was targeting those cut banks where You could tell the current had been there when the water was a little higher, but the water was pulled back. I was chucking them up under the cut banks, and I was catching, you know, those 15 to 16 inch big smallmouth tucked up under there. I really wish I could have found some of those bigger ones that we found in practice. I mean, I think I lost like an over 20 in practice, which was pretty unfortunate because it like jumped into the boat and jumped out. But white swim jig did almost all the damage. I'm pretty happy with my performance in that tournament. Having the Newport on the crescent really helped, just cruising the banks, hitting the spots I wanted to hit, because I had to cover a lot of water day 2. My day 2 wasn't as good as day 1, but I would argue that my day 2 performance was much better because it was fishing much tougher. I had to basically figure out my own pattern kind of on the fly, didn't really have that morning bite, so it was much tougher. It's just a bummer that we did lose that fish in the end, but overall lacrosse was a great time. So swim jigs, it's the new thing for me with smallmouth. I've been actually chucking them on the rivers down here. It's kind of like opened my eyes a little bit, but lacrosse was fun. Here's the Susky. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys next time.